This is episode 24 of Ice Ice Beta, a podcast about ice climbing, dry tooling, and today we're focused on mixed. Mixed climbing was always part of the alpinist bag of tricks, but the technical and impossibly steep style we know these days only started to come into its own in the 90s. The period has been referred to as the modern M revolution, a period when grades advanced rapidly from about M8 to M13 and lasted roughly from the mid-90s to the early 2010s. It was punctuated at the start by Jeff Lowe's ascent of Octopussy, WI6 M8 R, in 1994, and perhaps came to its conclusion in 2012 when Robert Jasper climbed Ironman in totally dry conditions and officially denoted it with a D grade, D14+, effectively spitting off a distinct discipline. Today, we chat with Raphael Slawinski, one of the leading mixed climbers during this time. Some of his accomplishments include sending some of the first M10s and M11s in Canada, climbing out the Stanley Headwall, including many routes he established, and topping out the unclimbed 7,040-meter K6 West in Pakistan with Ian Welsted, for which they won a Piolets d'Or. I want to note that he managed all of this as a quote-unquote weekend warrior, since his full-time profession is physics professor. In this episode, we discuss the evolution of mixed climbing and the role of bolts, of course, advancements in techniques and equipment, his honest introduction and progression in the sport, desire versus judgment, a very careful balance, and close calls and risk management. All that and more right after a quick message from our sponsors.
Hi, it's Katie McKinstry Stylos, and when it comes to winter climbing, having the right gloves can make or break your day on the ice. With Anu, you're in good hands, a small boutique brand founded by passionate climbers for climbers. The mission is simple, to create the best ice climbing and dry tooling gloves that are durable, dexterous, and waterproof. Personally, I can't imagine climbing any day on tools without my new gloves. Whether I'm on a steep pitch and highlight climbing in my Vincent lights, belaying in the bingo cave with my Vincent mitts, or climbing at my limit in the Dolomites of Italy. They're my reliable partner in the cold and on tools. Experience the difference with Anu. Check them out at anu.com.
We get it. For us, ice season never really ends. It just kind of blends between rock, plastic, and plywood until waterfalls freeze again. No matter how you climb in the off-season, Furnace Industries keeps you going till your next bout of screaming barfies. With their gym-safe dry ice evolutions, you can keep up your fitness indoors. And if you're looking to challenge yourself on your home wall, they have the largest variety of dry tooling holds in America. Check out their full lineup of ice and dry tooling gear at furnace-industries.com. Because for us, it's always ice season.
I'm looking forward to this conversation because you're a man that appreciates history, and we're going to be doing a lot of talking about history.
Yeah, I think it's important to know the context, and if nothing else, to keep us humble that we're not the first ones doing this.
Not the first, won't be the last.
Exactly.
A few years ago, and what's interesting is I only saw this on Will Gadd's Instagram profile, and I haven't seen it anywhere else, not even on your own, but according to Will Gadd, a few years ago, you completed a 25-year project, more or less, by completing all the routes at the Stanley Headwall. And you can clarify, because I'm not sure if it's all of them, but at the time, it seemed to be. During those years, so I think it was something like hundreds of days that you were on that wall, you've quested, you've established numerous FAs, you've taken some major falls, and I'm wondering, what the Headwall has meant to you and what role it's played in your life as a climber to be so dedicated to that space.
Sure. So maybe just first of all, for the record, you would not have seen it on my social media because I'm not a social media person.
You do have Instagram, though.
I do. I have not made a single post on it. My goal, as I like to joke, is to acquire 1,000 followers without a single post. Anyhow, what Will said is more or less correct. Now, it was never really a project. It was never something I pursued as a goal. It was just something that happened quite organically. But yeah, I kind of realized one particular day that I think coming out of the Headwall is that with the route we did that day, which was something I hadn't done before, I had basically climbed all of the major lines and variations in the Headwall. Now, as you alluded to, have I climbed every pitch on the Headwall? No, absolutely not. There are some single pitch routes, there are some obscure variations, and in fact, since that day a few winters ago, couple more bigger routes went up, and I haven't done those. So yeah, so I guess as always happens with these kinds of lists, they kind of stop being current. But yeah, the Headwall was hugely significant to me for God, quarter century, I'd say, or thereabouts. My first climb on the Headwall, I want to say was in late winter 1996, was the classic ice climb Nemesis. And it was a big step for me. It was one of the hardest things I had done up to that point, and I was quite intimidated going up there. Then even coming out, I remember skiing out of there, floating quite high, having done this route and having gone beyond where I thought I could go as a climber, and then seeing a couple of climbers topping out on another harder, more committing line called French Reality, and just thinking, wow, that's they're cosmonauts out there. So yeah, ever since the Headwall in different ways played a huge role. So I think it was the following year, so late winter, early spring of '97, that a friend and I made what turned out to be the second ascent and the first free ascent of a long mixed route called the Day After les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot. I had learned a lot in the intervening year, and that actually was a step, not just personally, but I guess without false modesty, maybe a step for Rockies mixed climbing in general. And yeah, there are lots and lots of good days since, like you alluded to, some first ascents, which sometimes went very quickly, sometimes required repeated trips, and yes, some not so good experiences, like late in 1997. Actually, I still remember the day quite exactly. It was December 1st, 1997, was when I broke the dagger on the hanging dagger and suffer machine and took a giant ride where basically my feet kissed the ground from 25 meters up.
Oh, wow.
And that could have gone any which way. So I was very, very lucky to walk away from that one.
So I did just pull up, I don't know why I didn't recognize this earlier. I did just pull up your Instagram. For the listeners, he's at 714. You're only following one person. You're following the Bozeman Ice Fest.
If memory serves, I created my account so that I could access the program for the Bozeman Ice Fest, because I was going there to teach some clinics or do a slideshow, I forget, and I needed to see the program.
Back in the days when you could like register for things with Instagram. Just for the audience listening, it's Raphael.Slawinski with a W, so Slawinski. Let's see if we can get him to 1,000. That's a positive usage of social media, right? That's a validation for you.
For a meaningless goal, but thank you.
You're welcome. In our initial call, you actually had talked about sort of limiting, I think, your online presence too, because you used to be quite detailed, I think, in documenting climbs and routes, and you had a very active blog for a while. And blogs generally across the climbing world seem to have gone away. I mean, Colin Haley had a really, really useful one as well, and it's updated every like 3 years. And then you stopped. I did find it a little funny because like your third to last article, you're talking about this very subject actually. You had just completed a Chris Kalous project.
Yeah, a rock route in the Ghost area.
So there's a few tendrils here that I find particularly humorous, because you had an interview with Chris Kalous, and at the end of it, he's basically like begging you to go climb it. And I don't know if this is the same route, but yeah, there's this sort of element, and then you go and do it, and then basically you stop writing about these things after the fact. So it's almost like Chris got his satisfaction, you got the satisfaction, and then poof, there goes social media.
Yeah, and and obviously, as you said, blogs and specific climbing blogs were a thing for a while, and there were some excellent ones out there. You mentioned Colin Haley's blog, which I always really appreciated. likewise for Nick Bullock's blog. I have to say, occasionally I do come across people who say, hey, I really enjoyed going through your blog and reading about this or that, and kind of makes me a little wistful and thinking that makes me think that maybe I should go back to it, even if very few people read it. Obviously, blogs don't have the reach of sort of more instantaneous media. Who knows? I don't want to say never again. But yeah, I just not so much got sick, but maybe lost some interest in recording those things. At the same time, life and work got more busy, and basically something had to give, and I wasn't willing for that to be time outside.
Yeah, understood. I did. Well, this interview might verge on wistful throughout. So with that as the precursor.
Well, that's yeah. To quote an old friend, old in a couple meanings of the word, Steve Swenson, it's a symptom of creeping old fartism.
That's a nice one. Anyways,
well, and but at the same time, I also have to say that as someone who is getting along in the tooth and has been climbing for quite a while, yeah, on the one hand, I appreciate talking about the good old days. On the other hand, I think sometimes people overdo it, and I don't want to. I want to guard against it. I want to go out and have fun in the present and not just live in the past, because certainly that's something that you do see, and I'd like to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, you're not living in the past, but part of my job as an interviewer is to talk about part of this, because I do, as we spoke about before, I view this a little bit as like an archival project, so that you've played an important role in the development of mixed climbing, especially in the Canadian Rockies. So we will talk a lot about this, but we will also talk about, for your own sanity, some of the climbs you're doing now. So that's my caveat.
Yeah, no, and I don't take that the wrong way. I'm happy to talk about history, both my own personal history and more broadly.
Yeah, let's get some of that on here. So we started with Stanley Headwall, and then kind of going back to the beginning, because you started rock and ice climbing in the early 90s. And then, this is sort of the really important piece of history for mixed climbing, because it's kind of the start of the modern M revolution. But then by the late 90s, you're already establishing first ascents in places like the Stanley Headwall and then elsewhere. And to me, that seems kind of a really rapid progression, because to establish mixed routes, and I think you were doing traditional ground up and bolted. I'm not quite sure, so correct me if I'm wrong. But it's a lot of skills, it's a lot of like ability required to do this. And I'm wondering, like, what was your progression like in those years that allowed you to sort of start doing FAs?
It's interesting you should call that a fast progression, because, say, seeing some of my younger friends these days, it seems like they make that jump a lot more quickly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So in terms of history, I took my first steps climbing actually late 80s and very early 90s, starting with kind of classic mountaineering. Then, ironically enough, it was moving away from the mountains, moving to the flatlands of Chicago, where I was going to graduate school, that got me into technical climbing, because there are no mountains to tromp up on. So I turned to rock and ice climbing in sort of nearby canyons, which were not that nearby. It was at least 2 or 3 hours away from the city. Then when I moved back to the Rockies in the mid-90s, I kind of dove into it. But I would not necessarily call that a very fast progression. So say between first doing technical ice climbing, let's say around 92, and actually my very first steps ice climbing were taken in the Ghost. While I was visiting a family over Christmas, we went into the Ghost and played around there, sort of failing to get up a pitch of grade 3 over the course of an entire day. And then, yeah, about 5 years later, doing things like freeing Missoula and the Stanley Headwall. So 5 years is both a short time, but also not but also it's a pretty long time. And so I always considered my progression to be somewhat gradual. And maybe part of the reason for that is that, especially having started ice climbing largely while I was living in the Midwest, I was not part of the local scene in the Rockies. And so when I came back, I was not plugged in and climbing with the hot climbers of the time. I was climbing with friends that I made and partners that I found, which meant that typically I was the strongest person on the team, which was not saying very much. And in some ways, I think it made for a slower progression because I was not being rope gunned up things too hard for me to lead. Basically, anything I wanted to climb, I had to be prepared to lead. At the same time, I like to think that this kind of progression gave me a really solid base. It was a very honest introduction in the sense that I couldn't fool myself that I was better than I really was. And well, maybe sometimes I did fool myself, as I think we might talk about later. I went through a phase where I had a close call every 6 months or so. So maybe I did think I was better than I really was. But yeah, I like to think that that it did give me this sort of basis of self-sufficiency and confidence that, yeah, if I'm going to get up this thing or not at all.
I want to hear more about these younger climbing partners that you have now that are progressing faster, because on this podcast, I've had several guests talk about how they didn't even consider leading ice, until 5 to 8 years after they started. And so that's quite a bit different, just leading ice versus freeing a route on the Headwall, for example. So I guess, what are you seeing these days?
Yeah, no, and now that you mentioned that, I'm trying to think of specific examples. Yeah, I guess I can think of going out with much younger friends who, say, are very strong rock climbers, and very quickly they get to climb routes which would have been at some point dream routes for me. But you're right that that they don't necessarily do it, at least at that stage, on their own, and they're not the drivers of the enterprise. So now, with that, maybe I take back some of what I said. That yeah, it makes for a faster sort of climbing with people who are stronger than you at a particular stage in your climbing career. Makes for a faster progression in terms of a tick list. But then you have to be honest with yourself. How solid is the tick list? Are these routes that I could have done on my own? Not talking about soloing, but with me leading the cruxes, say. Or are these routes where I was not necessarily dragged up, but routes where I definitely drafted behind a stronger partner? So maybe I need to revise some of what I said earlier about my progression being slower than usual. Maybe in terms of getting out on the sharp end and doing those things kind of with you as the engine of the enterprise, maybe there was not such a slow progression after all.
I don't mean to be pedantic, and this is not about like, I gotcha. It's more of just like, I was really curious, actually.
No, and it's a matter of perception too. I think, yeah, maybe I always perceive myself as being as somehow being lagging behind and being slower.
If you're establishing FAs on the Stanley Headwall within a few years of starting to climb technical routes, I don't think that's the case. But there is a dynamic that I kind of want to dive into. There's something about like your headspace and climbing that I don't quite know, and I'm hoping we can unwrap it a bit. You talked about how sort of like every 6 months or so you had like a near catastrophe. I guess I'm curious, like when you were going up these routes, because you oftentimes were the strongest climber in that party, what was your headspace? How are you approaching it? How are you evaluating risk and things like that?
I can certainly remember some of those close calls. At the risk of falling back on cliches, it's this balance between desire and judgment. And I think, especially in those days, the desire often won out over judgment, or maybe even more so, maybe the judgment wasn't truly there. So for example, one of those close calls, I can remember, it was And again, I remember the date reasonably well, not to the day, but it was September 1996. And a friend and I went to climb an alpine mixed route on Mount Andromeda in the Columbia ice fields, a route called Shooting Gallery. It's not an especially big route. I have since done that route in a very few hours car to car. But on that particular day, it was actually quite a serious place to be because, first of all, even though it was already September, it was quite a warm day. There was a bit of a weather front moving in, and so the freezing level was really high. And the crux of the route is this little half rope length of steeper rock halfway up the gully, which sometimes has some thin ice over it. And when it does, it's glorified grade 4, if that. On that particular day, there was this veneer of slush over it, and I headed up on this pitch. And I do mean slush. Whatever was covering the rock wasn't substantial enough to hold the picks of the tool. So I was basically hooking the rock underneath. And really, it should have been terrifying. The belay was somewhere 10 meters down the snow slope. I had no gear between me and the belay. It should have been an absolutely terrifying proposition, but I wasn't terrified, which was stupid. I should have been terrified, and I should have been terrified backing off, but it really did not occur to me to back off. I just kept climbing until what was probably inevitable happened, and my tool slid off whatever rock edges I was hooking underneath the slush, and I fell off and then flew through the air and then slid down the slope and basically factored to this belay of pins, which again, fortunately, it was at that point, it was more of a sliding fall than a fall through the air. And so the anchor held. And I was pretty banged up, but then again, I probably should have thought better about the whole situation. But instead, I headed up a different line, and we actually topped out the route. Actually, in a thunderstorm with lightning striking the rock pinnacles near the top of the route. So things went badly and could have gone much worse in more ways than one. And it's kind of embarrassing to talk about it because I certainly don't feel proud, and I don't think one should feel proud of this kind of getting away by the skin of your teeth, but in some ways almost not even knowing the risks you're running. I think running a risk maybe could be something that demands respect when you go into a situation with your eyes wide open, knowing that you're running that risk. But if you don't even know you're running the risk, you're just being stupid. You're not being bold. Whether that kind of maybe helps to illustrate some of the headspace I had back in the day, which again, I like to think that I grew out of reasonably quickly, even if I continued to go up on climbs that required boldness, whether on individual pitches or just generally for attempting a particular line.
I imagine that's like one of your special skills, if I could call it that. You also talked about how one of your superpowers is your stubbornness. And I guess I'm wondering, when you're out doing really bold climbs, because you've established, I think, M6X routes, things like that. Maybe I misread, but do you channel that, or does that sort of come naturally for you as you're like in the process of climbing?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it comes very naturally. So, for example, I am not much of a soloist. Like all climbers, I've dabbled in soloing through the years. There were definitely times when I spent more days, especially in the winter, on ice soloing moderate routes. I still think it can be a really fun, rewarding thing to do, but I've never soloed I never soloed anything hard. In some ways, I think I almost found it easier to be bold with a rope on, which potentially is not completely rational, because in a way, climbing a hard run-out route could be more dangerous than soloing a moderate one. The likelihood of a bad outcome could actually be higher with the rope on. But anyway, to come back to your question about the headspace and whether it comes naturally or it's the switch I need to flip, I think to some extent it is a bit of a switch that I flip, especially after experiences like that one I described on Shooting Gallery. I have try to become more self-aware and to appreciate when I am stepping into a dangerous situation, and then make a conscious decision about whether I want to go into that situation or not. And I've certainly maybe backed off more since then. It comes back to this balance of desire and judgment that you may really, really want to do something, but hopefully you have the wisdom and judgment to say, no, that's a bad idea. The chances of a bad outcome are just too high. Having said that, like you mentioned, over the years, I have done a number of risky climbs, but I'd like to think that ever since that day on shooting gallery, there have been more calculated risks. So again, to tell another story, give another example, one of the biggest climbs I ever did with my friend Ian Welsted, just over 10 years ago in 2013. Ian and I, over the period of a few days, climbed to the top of an unclimbed 7,000-meter peak, K6 West, by a quite technical route. And I think it was our third day in, our second day on the face, that kind of one of the first pitches that morning, I was going up a pitch of very thin ice over pretty crappy sandy granite. And I was looking at the next section where that got steeper with very marginal gear. I realized that basically I had reached the decision point that to continue would mean taking a substantial risk, and that I could back off. And that if I did continue, I would take a risk in a very serious situation. I mean, we were above 6,000 meters on a big face in the Karakoram with zero chance of outside rescue. So if I fell off this pitch and, say, broke a leg, things would be very, very serious indeed. And so it was quite a conscious flip of the switch that, okay, I want this thing badly enough that I'm willing to take the risk, and I'll climb accordingly. I'll climb like I mean it, all the time being aware that I am pushing the boat out.
Interesting that like conscious flip, like, because people will talk about flow and sort of, being hyper attuned and sort of taking the situation as it comes. And I feel like some people might take that situation and the anxiety might make them climb more poorly. But I imagine at that point, you probably had so much experience that you knew, like, this is what I do. You're able to control, I guess, the fear factor.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And for sure, this flow has to be there. If you're trying to consciously think about every micro decision you have to make, you will not do it well. So you have to be, to some extent, on autopilot. Now, the risk of waxing poetic, there is this element of kind of just entering the zone where your consciousness both closes down and opens up. Closes down in the sense that you just think about this little 2-meter circle around you because nothing else matters too much, but at the same time opens up because you're acutely aware of sort of every little nubbin that you may be hooking or standing on. So I don't mean to imply that all the time I keep thinking very deliberately about what I'm doing. At the same time, you're right. There is this kind of conscious pushing away of the fear that yes, this is a situation where it'd be quite natural to be afraid, but to kind of realize, and easier said than done, that fear is not constructive here, and so I must push it away and hopefully help to climb better and to climb without making mistakes, without rushing.
We're going to dive into the modern M revolution a little bit more. So you are part of the ascension of the modern M revolution, and you climbed some of the first M10s and M11s, I think in Canada, but maybe elsewhere as well. It was a mix of traditional lines, and then sport mixed climbing really started to come onto the scene in, I think, the mid to late 90s. And jumping ahead a little bit, in 2002, you wrote the sort of modern history, sort of placing where modern mixed climbing was and sort of giving some backstory where it originated and some of the technology advancements, things like that. And so it was really interesting. I loved it. It's called Degrees of Freedom. It was a 2002 American Alpine Journal article, and we'll link to it in the show notes. Great read. But one of the arguments against modern sport mixed climbing was that, it didn't help you develop your like head game. There was, this mental muscle that you needed to develop. And there were like all these different camps and feedback and pushback. And some of it was kind of like old man yells at cloud kind of vibes to it. But one of your core theses of the research in the article was that you propose that modern mixed climbing would help push advancements in the alpine terrain, and you start to see a lot more harder technical routes at altitude, which you helped establish. But some of the pushback was that actually that wasn't the case. Like some of the advancements had stopped in the 80s, essentially. I guess living through it now and having that perspective, like where do you think, like has the modern M revolution, has it helped push alpine climbing forward quite a bit?
Yeah, so well, that was that was really a fun time in winter climbing with these two somewhat conflicting currents. So yeah, in this particular discussion on kind of on one side, you had Steve House and the self-styled Brotherhood, very much on the alpine climbing side of things, and on the other side you had the sport wankers, so to speak, like myself and others. Now, like all such distinctions, it's a bit of a caricature in the sense that it's never quite as clean as that. As already alluded to through some of my stories, my adventure with climbing started through mountaineering, and alpine climbing has been this thread that has been running through my climbing basically ever since. So I was never a pure sport/competition climber. Nevertheless, like you said, for a number of years, I dove into it quite a bit. I like to think that overall, maybe with some delay, the argument or the thesis I was making in my AAJ article, I think it did come true to some extent. So I think the counter argument, as you outlined it, was that, yeah, these people are getting stronger and stronger, but they're just doing it on the bolted roadside crags, and that will never transfer to the quote unquote real thing. And there's obviously a truth to that. So even just looking around the Canadian Rockies these days, there's a huge group of people for whom winter climbing is largely that. It's going to, so Rockies climbers will recognize the names of venues like the Playground and Hafner Creek. And a lot of people spend their winter days going there and clipping bolts and hang dogging and having fun. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And they have no desire in taking those skills anywhere else. And I think that's always going to be true for the vast majority of people. I would say that my argument was a little more statistical, that given this larger population of highly technically proficient climbers, if a few of those take those skills into the alpine, well, right there, that'll be progress. Now, is climbing something that goes towards a certain goal? Is progress even a meaningful concept here? That's arguable. But if we define, for the purpose of our discussion, if we define progress as climbing harder, technically more difficult things in the mountains, then I think having, again, this larger base of people who can crank really hard at the crags, and again, a few of whom will take the skills beyond, I think that has to have an impact. And I would argue that it has had that impact. So you look at younger climbers, and some of them not so young anymore, and some of them unfortunately no longer with us, like Uli Steck. But again, someone like Uli Steck, obviously incredible headspace, but also incredible athletic and technical ability. This was someone who could come to the Rockies and could put up pretty high-end M routes, but obviously then would go to the Himalaya and solo high-end routes on 8,000-meter peaks. Someone I like to refer to in this context as well is Scottish climber by the name of Greg Boswell. So Greg maybe hasn't done a ton in the biggest mountains, but in terms of being able to climb hard both at the bolted crags and then to climb very, very hard in very serious settings in the Scottish hills. I see someone like Greg as someone who doesn't have hang-ups that, oh, this is lame, this is bolted climbing. This is just someone who's good. And I think, I don't know, maybe that's a North American thing. We have all these hang-ups about rad versus trad, whereas, again, maybe I'm not sure if I'm right here, but I think I see a lot of European climbers just being good and not having hang-ups about this or that. So I think this is maybe that has happened in the intervening years, that people have just become good. And again, not everyone, obviously, but a number of people, and here I'm going to caricature this, but instead of having just people who maybe climb M12 or M14 or whatever, but couldn't climb a naturally protected M6. And at the other end, you have people who climb 5'9" or 5'10", and there was another almost culture war thing that the alpinists refused to use M grades, and for a long time they held on to the Yosemite decimal system even for mixed climbing, almost as a point of honor. But then you have this crew of people who can climb run out 5'9" in the mountains, but couldn't get up an M7 pitch. I think those days are long gone, and I think now we have quite a few people who, again, are just good, and who can fairly seamlessly switch from one arena to the other. And I think that's cool.
Do you remember what the conversion was for YDS to M grades?
I mean, to this day, I'm not sure what that conversion is. It's well, and I'm actually being maybe deliberately difficult here, because I think it's such a hard conversion, and there's such different strengths too, especially at the upper end. So someone, for example, can be a really, really strong M climber, but could be a pretty average rock climber, and vice versa. But yeah, I think roughly speaking, the conversion, as I remember, would be that M6 would roughly correspond to 5'10". And so as such, for example, traditional M6 with tricky protection could feel quite serious, just as, let's say, 5'10" on less than perfect rock with iffy protection could feel pretty heads up, even for someone who technically is a much, much stronger climber. But I would think of sort of M8 as being somewhere hard 5'11", easy 5'12", thereabouts.
Maybe to take a step back and talk more about the time with which, these grades are getting pushed. Do you mind just talking about what the scene was like? What was taking place at that time? What were the advancements that was allowing things to progress so quickly?
Yeah, so again, here I'll go back to what I said earlier, that when I moved back from the Midwest to the Rockies was in the fall of '94, and basically I've been here ever since and climbing lots and lots and lots. So as I mentioned, I was never, or at least at that point, I was not part of the scene. So I guess I have a bit of an outsider's perspective on what the scene was like back then. And I certainly did not know, at least at that time, the protagonists who were putting up routes like Mixmaster. But yeah, to your point about what allowed this progression to happen, I think in a word, bolts. Especially on Rockies limestone. I guess limestone in general, but maybe Rockies limestone especially. I mean, the Canadian Rockies have a sometimes not completely deserved reputation for bedrock, but a lot of the time that reputation is justly deserved. And so you just won't push your limits if the protection is marginal. And so what allowed people to push those limits, and as you say, to go from Mixmaster, which depending who you talk to, and depending how it forms too, is somewhere between M5 and M6, M5 in fatter conditions, M6 in lean conditions. But still, in terms of the actual movement, that is not hard movement. And then very quickly, by the end of the decade, by the end of the 90s, yeah, we are getting into the upper end of M11. And by early 2000s, we're going into M12, M13. Again, that is largely down to bolts. And as a result, people who would have come into the sport largely from a rock climbing background, taking this rock climbing prowess and applying it to winter movement. Specifically, one person I think about here is my old friend Ben Firth. Ben is an interesting guy. So he was the son of British or English expats. His father, Jack, was a longtime climber. And so he brought this almost English sensibility of head pointing to rocky scragging. And so he combined this idea of hard climbing in potentially dangerous situations. And so then Ben took that. And so he was the person behind some of the first M12 and M13 routes in the Rockies. Specifically, I'm thinking of Musashi and the game in the Cineplex Cave up on the Icefields Parkway. And again, those routes would not have happened without people like Ben. Those routes would not have happened without bolts. Now, did that trickle down into the Alpine? I think eventually, but slowly. And I think for good reason, because in the end, the conditions in the Alpine still would not have changed, and the rock would still have been bad. And so it would still have been a serious game, but slowly, the grades in the Alpine have crept upwards. Now, even to this day, at least in the Rockies, the grades in the Alpine are not that high. So, especially in recent years, especially some visiting climbers like Luka Lindic have put up big new Alpine routes with pitches of M7 plus and M8 on them. Given the numbers these days with people climbing M15 and 16 at the crags, that doesn't sound that impressive. But when you, maybe with a bit of, and for that, maybe you need to have climbed in the Rockies, especially on a big Alpine face in winter, those numbers have a different meaning in that context. And so to my mind, even though that may not seem like very fast progression, to my mind, that's still incredible that someone is cranking those grades high up on a first ascent on a big north face in winter.
So there's the bolts that you summed up in one word as sort of one of the driving forces for the advancements of technical difficulty. But I'm also curious about tools, because I just got my hands on a sweet copy of Ice World by Jeff Lowe, which was published in '96. And he's climbing on these like Charlet Mosers, and I had to look it up. They're either Axars or Pulsars, and they have
Pulsars.
Leashes. Okay,
Yeah.
Sweet. Were you climbing with leashes? And then when did things start?
Well, of course I was. There was nothing else. Yeah, and that's kind of the curse, but also the beauty of not knowing any better. I mean, just as we don't know what people might be climbing on 10, 20 years from now. And so we're psyched with what we've got. And so back in the mid 90s, I was psyched to have a pair of Pulsars, just like Jeff Lowe. And yeah, very much climbing with leashes. And there were all kinds of different and elaborate leash systems so that they would allow you to place gear. So some people would dangle the tool off the wrist as they, for example, place screws. There were other sort of fairly elaborate leash systems that allowed you to efficiently get in and out of the leash. So I was always a fan of that. I used the system that at the time anyway, I used the system that Charlet Moser, which was later acquired by Petzl, used, which was again a kind of a fancy slider. God, now I hadn't thought about that in years. That's right. I think at a later point, even though I climbed on the Pulsar still, I think I adopted a leash system from Gravel that had a particularly clever way of getting in and out of the leash. And then at a bit of a later stage, at that point, I was climbing on Black Diamond tools like the Black Prophets and the original, not the current, but the original Cobras, then clip leashes were a thing for a while as well, which had their advantages, but their downfalls as well, as in unclipping when you didn't want them to. But yeah, it was all leashed climbing, and that's maybe actually one area where competition actually fed back into quote unquote real climbing. I would say overall ice climbing competitions have had minimal impact on climbing in the real world. To a large extent, as far as I can tell, again, I haven't competed in years and decades, but as far as I can tell, it's really things like World Cup ice climbing has become a sport onto itself, with almost no overlap with the real world. But leashes, I think, is one area where competition fed back into quote unquote real climbing, because it was competitions that first drove the movement towards leashless climbing. If memory serves, it was at one of the World Cups, the decision was made sort of just before the start of the season to ban leashes, which had all the competitors scrambling and jury rigging some occasionally very painful support systems to work instead of leashes. And then that started feeding back and started getting adopted in the world of real ice and mixed climbing. And initially you had, again, maybe in the spirit of what you referred to earlier, sort of old man shouting at the clouds. I think initially, maybe especially the old guards was very skeptical of this. As like, this will never work. You'll be climbing some wet waterfall with an inch of ice coating everything, and you'll wish you had your leashes. And I think they were proven quite wrong fairly quickly, because it was just so much more convenient not to be tethered to your tools. And so it is a transition that happened fairly quickly. So for myself, I think the very first season when I went more or less fully leashless was 2003. And I would have gone leashless sooner, but that was at that point, and ever since then, I've been climbing on BD tools. And the first leashless tool that BD made was a mixed or largely dry tooling and competition tool, the original Orange Fusion, which the old timers will remember. However, I could never get the tool to work for me in ice. To my mind, it dry tooled beautifully, but swung horribly. And so it wasn't until BD released a full-on leashless ice climbing tool that I made the switch to leashless. But yeah, very quickly, I went from climbing basically everything, maybe except for dry tooling leashed, to very quickly climbing essentially everything leashless.
Did you ever use heel spurs?
Oh yeah. They're very much a thing. Kind of late 90s, early 2000s. You definitely wanted boots that laced up really tight, so that as you hung from your heels, that you didn't slide out of your boots. But yeah, it was for a season or two, I used heel spurs a lot. And then a particular day and a particular climb kind of brought home to me the absurdity of the style of climbing. So at that point, I had already red pointed Musashi, which was then one of the hardest routes around. And I was back in the Cineplex cave to climb something else. And at the end of the day, just to round out the day, I thought I would do another lap on Musashi. And halfway up the climb, I dropped one of my tools. And then I realized I was actually at a comfortable, not stance, but rather hang, where I could hang from my heel spurs. And I loosely looped into one of nearby quick draws and then lowered a loop of rope to pull up my tool, never weighing the rope once. So the layer sent my tool back up. I got my tool back and undid this loose loop and continued and topped out the climb. And I realized that at that point that this whole climbing with heel spurs is just stupid, that I am not strong enough to hang out in the middle of Musashi for 10 minutes, that this, there's always been, there was always this tension with dry tooling being glorified aid climbing, but that particular occasion made me realize that with heel spurs, it is not just glorified aid climbing, it is aid climbing. And so that was basically the last time I used heel spurs. It just kind of lost its interest.
Heels are for horses, as was once declared. I am curious about your aesthetic and what good style is for you, because, you know, it seems like a lot of the routes that you go after, and especially when you're on-site and you're doing like a ground up on-site, oftentimes placing your own gear, at least maybe more recently. Is that an aesthetic that you're particularly interested in these days? Like, what's the style that you're sort of like going for these days?
So certainly the style of doing something ground up on all natural gear, all traditional gear, to some extent, is the ideal, and it is an ideal that I definitely tried for, sometimes succeeded in the past, and to this day. So one climb that stands out for me was this variation to another route on the Stanley Headwall that I called Victoria's Secret Deviation. So I remember just reading about a hard route that went up in Scotland called that I think was called Victoria's Secret, no, I think it was just called The Secret.
Yeah.
That's right. It's actually a route I got to do since then, which was really fun. But I remember at that point, it was, I think when it first went up, it might have gotten overgraded, as often happens maybe with an initial burst of enthusiasm. But anyway, it was a very aesthetic hard line that got put up on site. And so I spied this somewhat discontinuous crack line on the Stanley Headwall, and I thought, oh, this is going to be the Rockies version of The Secret. And so I got very excited about trying to climb it on site and ground up. And in the end, I failed in that because I took a bit of a whip when trying it the first time. And so I didn't on-site it. Nevertheless, I still managed to climb it fully ground up. So I came back here the next day and finished climbing it ground up on all natural gear. So that style, I still think is in some ways the nicest style you could use. I also appreciate that, as I mentioned earlier, I've been bold occasionally, but certainly not big into soloing. I don't want to die or even get seriously injured on a climb. And so there are very clear limits to what I'm willing to try in that style. But nevertheless, more broadly, in terms of good style, this is maybe I come down on the Steve House side of things. I started into climbing in general through mountaineering and through alpine climbing, you could say. And so to this day, I have a bit of that aesthetic where, for example, I do not love the idea of fixed lines. I've rarely ever used fixed lines. And now this will be in a rock climbing setting rather than a mixed climbing setting. But a couple of years ago, I wrapped up a big multi-pitch route on a local wall. I forget now how many pitches, 12 or 14 pitches, something like that. And I very consciously refused to go top down, which would have been quite easy because there's just a scree slope on the other side. So it's very easy to walk up to the top. I also very consciously did not use fixed ropes, which meant much slower progress because especially as we got higher and higher on the route, it would mean basically reclimbing all the lower pitches. And then by the time we got to the high point, there'd maybe be enough time to add one more pitch and then it was time to go down. In the end, climbing is not a goal in itself, but I would say it's a means to an end. And we're not just trying to establish these routes as quickly as possible, but I like to think we're trying to get something out of the whole process. And so certainly it was a very gratifying process to do it like that. And so to my mind, maybe good style means that is to maybe self-consciously limit the means at our disposal to put up a route. Now, whether that means not using bolts at all or using bolts sparingly, going ground up, not using fixed lines, all those things which, yeah, are contrived. But then again, all of climbing is contrived. So it just makes, I think, playing by those rules makes the game more interesting. A few years ago, I got to climb in Scotland, on which occasion I got to do this through the secret, which was really fun. It wasn't so fun at the time because did in a classic Scottish sort of hurricane force winds and blowing snow. So it was quite miserable at the time, but it's a good memory. But it's actually, I think the Scottish hills are kind of a neat encapsulation of good style because again, with their not big mountains, typically you'll have a cliff that is easily accessible from the top, and it would be also easy to go up there in, say, outside of the winter season, maybe in the fall, and prep the route. But there are what you could consider hang-ups about winter climbing in Scotland. All these rules which are sometimes difficult for outsiders to understand about what does it mean for a route to be in good nick, as they say. But in the end, what it comes down to is preserving the challenge. The climbing there is on pretty small mountains. It's kind of a limited resource. And so basically it's a way of preserving adventure. And so I think in the end, that's what good style comes down to, is preserving adventure.
Yeah, you mentioned climbing is about getting something out of it. Maybe I'm paraphrasing, maybe incorrectly, but it's a means to an end, is basically what you said. And it makes me think about the self-deprecating way that you described the 90s for mixed climbing, which was, you can be on the leading edge if you find something that is sufficiently esoteric. And do you typically find yourself in esoteric places or pursuits or ideas? Maybe I'm thinking outside of climbing. Do you tend to try to look for things that are maybe a little bit out there?
I'm not sure if it's I don't think I'm consciously trying to be obscure or maybe just quite naturally I seem to be drawn to those things. And so I think what always drew me to something like mixed climbing is this combination of athleticism and adventure, that you get to do cool, interesting movement in a potentially serious, but certainly a very wild setting. And it's that combination that I think always appealed to me, and possibly doesn't appeal to everyone. I think at various points, people have said, oh, mixed climbing is not that hard. Just wait until all the strong rock climbers start doing it. And obviously some strong climbers have started doing it, but maybe not as many as we might have expected, just because they're not interested in it. Because, well, maybe it's cold and comfortable and sometimes scary, whatever the reason. But not everyone is into this combination of those factors. Like I said, kind of the physical and kind of the adventurous. Though something that always drew me. That it's sometimes on a big scale, sometimes on a small scale. Just the other day, a friend and I were doing a climb on a nearby rock face. It's a classic multi-pitch rock face called Yamnuska. We're on a route that had done many times before, but it had the last pitch basically does this crazy traverse where you basically traverse over the void. And we both commented on just how cool it was to be doing not crazy hard, but still somewhat hard moves in this setting that were 200 meters clean overhanging the base of the route. Those moves would not have felt as fun if they were 10 meters off the ground. We were climbing on bolts that were pretty spacey, but still bolts. So it was not some highly adventurous situation, but nevertheless, just this setting with the wind and the ravens circling above us, just kind of added that something to it that it would not have been the same had it again been some little crag or the gem.
Your contemporary Sean Isaac, who was one of the leaders in getting basically bolting mixed routes, he wrote an article in 2001, and he's sort of giving an insight to his mindset, but also being a little bit like optimistic for the future. And he has this quote. He ends the article this way: "The Canadian Rockies have unlimited possibilities for those with a vision. The future is only limited by one's own imagination." And the Rockies, obviously, there's a lot. but maybe Stanley Headwall might not have as much potential as it used to. And I guess I'm wondering for you, does that quote still ring true for the Canadian Rockies as a whole?
I guess it depends what we mean by potential. And I think the temptation is to think about potential meaning ever rising technical standards. And that's certainly one way to think about it. Now, I think the Rockies still have an amazing amount of adventure. It's that they're still quite a wild mountain range, and it's easy to lose yourself in this wilderness without necessarily pushing the limits. A couple of years ago, a friend who likes collecting peaks over certain cutoff recruited me to join him on a mission to climb one of those one of the more technical peaks in that category in the backcountry. We're basically for close to 3 days, we never saw anyone. We just ventured into a wild valley with absolutely no one around. And we had this really good time on this extremely rarely climbed peak. My friend figured that we were making the fourth ascent of this peak in over 100 years.
Wow.
Which was really cool. So, and again, did we climb a new route? No. Did we raise technical standards? No. But was it an amazing adventure? Yes. So I think that's something that we also need to appreciate, that the Rockies still have the potential to lose yourself in this wilderness. But maybe to not to completely skirt the question. As you pointed out, the Stanley Headwall, you have to start looking with a finer and finer eye, say, to find new lines. And nevertheless, a friend of mine did spend the latter part of this past winter putting up a new line. He didn't manage to quite finish it. The send will have to wait until next year. But some bits and pieces of ice and some bolts, some gear. And so again, I think it speaks to Sean's assessment that here is someone from a younger generation. And again, he has a vision that comes from having grown up with taking certain things for granted. So taking, for example, high-end M climbing for granted. And he thinks nothing of being 5 pitches up on the Stanley Headwall and busting into a sequence of figure fours. So again, so I think it's kind of fun to see that convergence of the new and the old, maybe a new vision of the steeper lines that maybe had been tried before, but at the same time with some old school sensibilities.
2 questions left, and they're kind of gimmies. What's next for you for climbing?
That's actually not a gimme. That's a hard question.
Excuse me for being presumptuous.
No. And it's a hard question because as life goes on, we change. We don't get any younger, and at a certain point, we don't get any stronger. Quite the opposite. Having said that, I like to think that I can still climb reasonably strong. So I cannot make that excuse. Nevertheless, I'm aware that time is passing and that I don't have all the time in the world. And at the same time, our priorities, our motivations change. Am I as driven as I was 20 years ago? Probably not. Almost certainly not. Obviously, some people lose interest in climbing altogether and get out of it and start doing different things, which is totally fine. I am still very passionate and driven about climbing. I still structure my week around either a training session or getting outside. So I still do a lot of climbing. Now, my appetite for risk has probably gone down. But yeah, in terms of what's next, I mostly just have a lot of fun getting out and doing it, whether it be mixed climbing, whether it be I probably rock climb and especially sport climb more than I ever did before. And it's really fun and rewarding. For the foreseeable future, I don't see any big trips in the horizon. Again, I'm lucky to live where I live on the Canadian Rockies. So right now, I don't feel the itch to go overseas and go on an expedition, but who knows, that may change. But yeah, for now, I am psyched to climb here where maybe I'm not sure myself about where my climbing will go.
Yeah. If you were to give your younger self one piece of beta, what would that be?
I'm not sure if there is something I would say, because I think that's the thing about being young and just getting into an activity. Things that I might say now when I'm not as driven, those would sound like pretty lame advice if some gray hair gave that advice to me 20 or 30 years ago. I think people, hopefully they'll have the wisdom or access to wisdom that will allow them to survive. But beyond that, I think people should make the choices that they make and make the mistakes that they will. We should absolutely feel free to make mistakes, again, as long as these don't have really bad outcomes.
If you want to follow what Raphael is up to, you can't. But you can help him reach 1,000 followers on Instagram. His handle is at Raphael, Raphael Slawinski, Slawinski. There are a bunch of articles and resources mentioned in the interview. So to find links to things like Raphael's blog and his article Degrees of Freedom, head to the show notes. As always, thank you to Hannah Noel for providing the intro music and Andrew Solomon for editing. Thanks for listening. See you all next week.